So it's my pleasure to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Bob Birnbaum, for a couple reasons. But the first is, this is a reboot of what I asked Bob to do on something like maybe March 1st, 2020. And he'll remember it well because this was the last talk we were able to do as the crisis was sort of unfolding live. And then we had to, obviously, as we all did, shut so many things down just to get through this very hard time. But in some ways, this signals then the new normal and relaunch. And this was a series that we had thought about well over a year ago that kind of anchors itself on continuous professional development, the education that we all need to continue after we are done with our training, but is so important because the field moves forward. And Bob is our vice president within the MGB system for continuing professional development, has a huge amount of insight into this. And I kind of asked him to speak on this simple topic, which is, can you just tell us again what it is and why we do it, but then really tell us how we can do it better and where the field's moving. And then we'll follow up on this in the months to come with a few other talks as well. So with that, Caitlin, I'll ask you to stop sharing ours and we'll turn it over to Bob and go from there. Welcome, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to screen share myself, and I am going to boot up my presentation. Hang on. And then I have to switch my displays. So you're seeing my outline, I take it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. So thank you, Eric and BEI, for the invitation. And I think it's great that there's this opportunity to do this with Mass General and Jim, also both good friends and colleagues. And yes, we did try this live. I keep my fingers crossed that that was not a super spreader event, that it was coupled to the onset of the COVID epidemic. But here we go, virtual. So just as Eric teed it up, what I would like to do is place continuing professional development in a context and give you a sense of the urgent nature of the problem and challenges of professional development that are confronting us in the clinical environment, getting even more challenging and interesting. The old Chinese proverb of "may you live in interesting times." And then how we're coupling education and training to patient safety, quality improvement, and value. What are some of the theoretical constructs, and I hope some practical tips. But I'll tell you, a lot of this is conceptual for you to think about and to tee up ongoing discussions. And then I'll give you an example of a disruptive approach and some of the innovations we've been playing with. I wanted to make you aware of this resource, which is Rayburn and Turco and Davis's book on continuing professional development in medicine and healthcare, which is an excellent resource on how better education can lead to better patient outcomes, and has a number of sections that touch on topics that I'll give you. So what I want to do here is, so I can read my titles, I'm going to move this bar here. Professional development exists obviously on a continuum, and the question could be asked, where lies the greatest opportunity for system change as we go forward? And I want to make a distinction which is just meant to see where, if we're educating the individual along a spectrum from UME to GME to CPD, it's applicable to all. What's a little bit ironic, but certainly understandable because our trainees are in the DNA of our institutions, is that about 20% of our professional lifespan is going to be spent in formal training, and about 80% of it is going to be spent in a looser training environment. And so we, in a way, historically, and I'm editorializing a little bit, have given short shrift to what should be the rigors of the training environment on an ongoing fashion through 80% of the professional lifespan. And if you want to change the system, you're going to probably have to intervene in a good way and in a robust way with the faculty and the staff as part of a large integrated healthcare delivery system like ours. A question's been raised, and the reason why I put this picture here of these ducks following this dog is that this is a well-known phenomenon in the animal kingdom with birds, that they imprint to the first or the first thing that they see when they hatch as being their mother. And one of the things that has been looked at as you look at trainees and what they've been taught in their training environment and you go out 10 or 20 years into their practice environment, what they learned in their training environment is very viscous, not necessarily changed easily by what is happening in their practice environment. Does that mean that they imprint like these ducks? Or does it mean that we have been somewhat anemic in what we've been able to expose our trainees to as they mature along their professional trajectory? The other thing I want to touch on is what are the increasing burdens of the practice environment that we have to take into account? And these are, I'm sure, intuitive to most. New delivery models that are driving the need for even more training. We have clinical data, and evidence-based medicine is increasing, and our old ways of doing updating of people are really antiquated by comparison. And I'm getting a little window saying that my connection's a little bit unstable, so you'll tell me if I'm, freezing or anything like that. And then there's the adoption of more innovations like clinical decision support embedded in the EMR. When do we teach? When do we rely on that? And AI, artificial intelligence, and deep learning tools, and the whole idea of collectivism around cognitive decision making, which is a whole field unto itself. How much should be the responsibility of the individual provider? How much should be the responsibility of the team? So as we go forward, one thing I wanted to make people aware of in the MGB environment is that we did have a task force. Eric and Jim participated in that task force. Price Waterhouse was asked in as a consulting agency to do a series of focus groups and interviews and to kind of peg us where we were in organizational learning as a healthcare learning environment. And what you see at the bottom is basically what we do is we typically reflexively go from content to performance measurement. That's our current state. We have some content we have to disseminate. We look for the nearest available record player. I'm now aging myself. We take off of the shelf. We then worry about or think about the pedagogy or the andragogy that we will have, the kind of instructional design, and then performance measurement. The goal is to go in the other direction, the arrow on the bottom. Start with what is our performance measurement? Are we having an impact with our educational interventions? What pedagogy or andragogy are we actually employing? That's either pediatric or adult learning. And then what technology do we need and what capabilities and what content then? Hopefully it could be somewhat agnostic as to what content we plug in. When you look at this utilitarian all the way to dynamic learning healthcare systems, where you lack any alignment between learning activities and business priorities, and that could be patient care. And here, an integrated strategy that creates a collaborative culture that's a source of competitive advantage. Price Waterhouse put us basically right here between utilitarian and reactionary. So we had a lot of room to grow. We also did this survey for both generalists as well as specialists, asking them some questions about the efficiency and satisfaction with what their learning environment was. We were also doing a bit of a time study on how much money we may or may not be wasting in terms of duplication or inefficiency. About 1,000 people responded, which is not bad when you put in the subject line, reducing administrative burden. Everybody responds. And the two that are kind of jump off the page is that when you ask how often were the activities duplicative, people would say a majority of the time. And when you would ask them, unfortunately, how useful were they for professional training, you got a minority of the responses that were positive. So I'm going to give you a little primer here that sort of sets the stage as to how someone who's immersed in instructional design thinks about this when they're putting together an educational activity. And it's the difference between declarative knowledge, just getting facts, knowing how to do something with those facts, procedural knowledge, and then the competency of being able to actualize what you've learned. And here there's a dividing line between the educational setting and the clinical setting. Sometimes this is abbreviated by saying knowing what to do, knowing how to do it, being able to show that you know how to do it, and then actually do it. And what we have spent the majority of our time, if you think about update lectures, if you think about the sage on the stage telling you what to do, open cranium, pour in information, send the person on their way, grand rounds, and we are very heavily predisposed to looking at these predisposing activities that align with declarative knowledge. The enabling activities, presentation, example, practice, feedback, and how we do that. For the sterling example of simulation, but other examples, is something that is only now first filtering into when we think about each and every venue that we're doing education on our faculty and our staff going forward. And then, of course, this has to be iterative and reinforcing over time. This is a nice paper that by Moore and Green that was actually published a bit way back in 2009. I also want to show you this Dreyfus model of skill acquisition, which is a really nice model for thinking about something that we always violate, which is we carpet bomb our target audiences all with the same information, and we don't stratify them or think about the heterogeneity of our target audiences, what I'm doing today. So basically what Dreyfus was talking about, that is, if you're an early learner, you need a heavier dose of lectures and webinars because you need more structured and routine education. But that diminishes over time as you go from novice to beginner to competent to proficient to expert. What goes up over time as you become an expert is that you need to know information more as it's embedded in your practice context. And that's not as important to the novice learner. So if you start to stratify your tools, and I'm going to explain a couple of these, like whether or not you do heat mapping or CDS in the EMR, whether or not you do gamification or social media, whether or not you do, this is low fidelity or high fidelity simulation, you got to keep this in mind in terms of the heterogeneity and the capabilities of your target audience. And so I'm going to give you a couple of facts. This was meant to get at the urgency of the moment in terms of our faculty and our staff and ongoing training. I pose them as questions, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to answer them. But what percentage of individuals receive recommended evidence-based medicine care for 439 quality indicators in preventative care, acute care, and chronic conditions? It's about 55% on average. So it's a flip of the coin when you see a healthcare provider, whether you're getting evidence-based best practices of care or you're getting something else. It has a very wide range. If you're talking about things that are more easily quantifiable, like cataracts, it's 80%. If you talk about my clinical area, which is behavioral health and alcohol dependence, is as low as 10%. What about medical error? Medical error is what number leading cause of death in the United States? Well, according to a Johns Hopkins study, it's third. After cardiovascular and cancer, medical error is the most likely cause of death. To what degree, how many premature deaths a year are associated with preventable harm in the healthcare environment? And that's not just, again, that's across the whole spectrum, but it's heavily weighted toward the 80% of those of us who are practicing past formal training. And it turns out it's about 400,000 lives per year. And when you think about this in the context of COVID, which is a tragedy, this is twice as much per year. COVID is over a period of 3 to 6 months. We will probably get here by January with COVID if some of the modeling is correct. And then what percentage of healthcare avoidable harm instances are related just to knowledge gaps and communication errors, not system errors? It's about half and half, according to the CMS, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And then in terms of the avalanche of information, how many journal articles and over what period of time are now published? So every 26 seconds, there's a new peer-reviewed journal article published, which is about 5,000 a day. So even if your scope of practice is 1/1000th of what's out in the medical literature, you'd have to read 5 articles a day in order to keep up. This raises this question about CDS embedded in EMR. What should we bother actually teaching? And also things like deep learning and AI algorithms, and we'll get to that. So the virtuous circle that I'm advocating for to improve clinical outcomes is that you have to acknowledge that there are both micro and macro pathways that exist that we have to change. We have to commit to teaching differently so that it's intimately interwoven into things like quality improvement and patient safety. We have to re-engineer what we're doing so that we have the tools in CPD, continuing professional development, to act as effective change agents. And how do we do that? And then we have to sustain and we have to, by policy, enforce standards that will allow us to keep this virtual circle going. So to prove to you that I've still got the heart of a millennial, although I've probably got one foot in the grave, I know I'm exaggerating my age, I put something in a slide that can actually move. And what I wanted to do was show you the difference between knowledge engineering and what that means, which is the technical, scientific, and social aspects of building, maintaining, and using a knowledge-based system, which would be the plumbing and infrastructure for a healthcare, knowledge-based healthcare system, and the systems engineering, which really points more to the system. And any system is a construct or a collection of different elements that together produce more results than are obtainable by any element alone. So if we look at a teaching example, like what's the best practice for using long or short-term opioids, what I've been talking about is missing information in education, and I've been filling in some of these other parameters that we tend to ignore, like how will the learners access the information, what are the learners' basic skills and capabilities, in their host attributes, what's their attitude and their motivation toward learning, and what are their group and social interactions. And we really have to think about these as embedded in the instructional design. We have to also think about how they complement the systems engineering issues, which are subsystems, and we have to align with them, like economic factors, organizational culture, policies and procedures, and then what's our quality management and compliance infrastructure apart from, and these have existed in silos, the educators and the quality improvement people. And what gets me up in the morning is thinking about how to make those more bi-directional and informative. So Shojiana a while ago published a paper looking at just grand rounds and saying, well, our grand rounds, should they always be linear dissemination of information, or can we think of a staged approach? And this is along the lines of what I hope are some practical tips, where we highlight clinical areas with quality problems in live symposia. It could be a grand rounds or a live symposia. In other words, identify the gap. Even if you're talking about the most cutting edge innovation or what you're doing in research, what clinical gap is it addressing, and how is it complementary to some of the factors that I'm identifying? And then explicitly, you could add some expertise in terms of quality content on specific topics, like what's a PDSA cycle, or how do we actually operationalize this? And then you could supplement the CME with post-event deliverables, like we're going to come back in 5 months for grand rounds after they're all didactic talks, but we're going to look at what you guys were able to harvest and how did it address this gap and how did you implement it. And then we could embed CME in larger QI initiatives, and I'll talk about that. So we collaborate with MIT, the Dean of Digital Learning. There's actually one of my favorite acronyms, which is MITILI, M-I-T-I-L-I, which is the MIT Integrative Learning Initiative. And through their computer science and artificial intelligence lab, they looked at 100,000 learners online, taking about 7 million video sessions online. And they came up with these 6 guiding principles that you should never violate. And we violate all of them all the time. And one of them is brevity. In other words, you shouldn't put anything online that's longer than 6 minutes. If I get sent something by someone that's a YouTube link, the first thing I do is put my cursor over it to see how long it is. And if it's longer than 10 minutes, I'm not going to watch it. And they looked at attrition rates. They also looked at informality. A professor should never be standing behind a podium. So when someone comes to us and say, we basically want to just repurpose, record and repurpose what it is that we're going to put out there, I basically say to them, sure, you could do that, but nobody's going to watch it. And better you pull the lecturer aside, like Eric and Jim could pull me aside and say, Bob, let's just have an informal conversation, ask you for 2 or 3 salient points, chapterize that, atomize it into sort of 2-minute segments and put that in a library and people will watch that. You have to talk at about 254 words per minute or people actually default to neurons that make them distracted, and people have looked at functional neuroimaging of this. I'm talking at about 254 words per minute. It's pretty fast, but you have to pause, and I don't do that as much as I should. And then you have to optimize the existing. This is what they're cautioning. Don't retroactively break into shorter chunks. It's less effective than creating what you have an online audience in mind. And with the move from COVID to virtual, these are becoming really, really important guiding principles. I'm only going to touch on, as I get to about 20 minutes here, and I'm mindful of the time. I want to be careful to leave some time for questions if there are any. Is that there's a spectrum now of machine judgment, clinical decision support and clinical judgment, and clinical judgment only. And so if, single polymorphic nucleotide, SNPs are changing every week and publishing about cancer chemotherapeutic regimens, why would we teach that? Can we operationalize something, again, if a person has faith in the clinical decision support, like in EPIC, which was not designed for clinical support, it was designed for billing capture more than clinical support. If we override 80% of our best, more than 80% of our best practice clinical decisions, so there's a credibility issue. But when you look at like who reads pap smears, it's the computer that does the image recognition. And if there's some uncertainty, then it's looked at by the computer and the clinician. And then it frees up the clinician to do other things that are heavily weighted toward clinical judgment. So this is kind of the dynamic that's evolving. We did a pilot where we looked at ongoing maintenance of certification, clinical improvement projects, and we just attached CME relicensure to them with about 700 physicians. We reduced the workload by about 10,000 hours in these various specialties. And then we basically did an ROI calculation as to how much money and administrative burden we were saving. And so this is along the lines of one of the groups that we're working with, Atrium Health in the Carolinas, did this beautifully. And I'll explain to you as an example of innovation what we've been doing with amplifier heat mapping. And we created this opioid module, Darren Cullen at Brigham, along with Eric Weiner and Sarah Wakeman, and Michael Rulin picked up on this, but they've attached it to all these other incentive programs, MOC4, some of their requirements for risk management, and so that you go in with one-stop shopping and you can fill all of this with one activity. And this is what we would ideally want to move toward. So one of the things we've done over the past year is we've installed the infrastructure for a new learning management system that both Eric and Jim have been great hubs at both AMCs, helping us explore both the limitations as well as the advantages. It's called the Ethos platform, Ethos CE. And you can see that since, and then we're just looking at over the last year that this has been installed, we've awarded about 250,000 credits. We've had about 19,000 activities, and we've had about 184,000 enrollments. And you can see with this geo heat mapping, these are attendees that are coming from around the world, most heavily populated in the US and obviously most heavily populated in Massachusetts, because about 2/3 of this particular learning platform is internal to MGB and the other third is external. Easy to get to, and you can sign on with single sign-on. Right now it is not an allocation, so when people want to post things, we do have a fee schedule for that. It's not prohibitive. We've started to fashion learner groups, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. But in the conversion to virtual, certain technology issues are coming up about how it relates to other systems. How do we assign courses? How do we track them? We've done some wonderful work with MGBIS, where we now have the ability for the entire workforce to target the right target audience and to actually see their completion rates for activities. And then there's all sorts of questions people are asking about their virtual activities in terms of how much can we charge if we were charging for live? How do we partition off exhibit space? How do we market them differently? I've talked about the instructional design. We're busier than ever, and this orange is COVID activities. We've gone from 129 grand rounds up to 137 that are virtual. This is pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. And then we have these learner groups I'll show you. And then these are the maintenance of certification that have attached to them credits. And then we're looking at these learner groups. So these are the learner groups that are growing out. So the strategic design for MGB professional development is to focus on the clinicians and researchers, to reapportion what we've been doing so that this is traditionally the grand rounds, the independent courses, and these learner groups. And these are the learner groups. I just mentioned what Jim's been doing over at the General with medicine, anesthesia, surgery, and the simulation learning lab, and what Eric's been doing over at the Brigham Education Institute. But there are other groups that have been building out on ethos, looking at these kind of courses. But we have a very strong priority looking at what would be best called learning analytics. How do we expand having a real value proposition and impact for MGB in community care, enriching it with behavioral health and social determinants? And we have examples of all of these. Facilitating clinical trials, and we're doing this with a COVID antibody study system-wide with Ravi Thathani, who's the Chief Academic Officer. And then facilitating diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, and we're doing this with Danny Monroe, and we have a learner group for DE&I. And then with Partners Innovation, looking at curriculum and, again, skill acquisition for entrepreneurship, people who want to get better at looking at how to basically commercialize their clinical discoveries and their care algorithms. And then this whole issue I've been basically focusing on, which is how do we harmonize these processes for board certification, relicensure, education. So finishing up here and kind of getting to a concrete example, I want to show you, and I think a number of you who are educators will be familiar with this Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically, and I love this quote from Mark Twain, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And basically, as you look at the Dunning-Kruger effect, this is the actual test scores. And this is actually the person's perception of how well they did. So if you look at the top quartile, the people who did really, really well, they're nihilistic. They thought they did worse than they actually did. And so they beat themselves up. This is all like people who are going for full professor at Harvard. If you go way down here and you look at the people who are in the lowest quartiles and you ask them how they did, they overestimate their performance, right? So the group we've been working with, it's a for-profit company called Knowledge Factor, actually trademarked this term, confidently held misinformation. They think they know what they're doing, but they don't. And obviously this is a red flag. I'm going to show you how we heat map this. That's what the red is, confidently held misinformation. And we've been doing quantitative analysis on this CHM, confidently held misinformation. And then we, through the Brigham Primary Care Research Network and with Bonnie Southworth's Health and Greg Meyer and Anne, before she bumped up to being CEO, we're correlating this with grounded qualitative analysis of the same people who did the quantitative heat mapping to look at their learning attributes, their strategy, their practice environment, the kind of things that I told you that are more systems engineering concerns. We are part of a founding group of healthcare systems around the United States. The hub for this is Knowledge Factor. These are the individuals that form the Clinical Advisory Board. It's being led by Brent James, who was one of the authors of the Quality Chasm that sort of led to the quality improvement movement through the IOM report. What we're doing is course sharing. We're basically taking what I've been talking about and looking at what's going on at these other healthcare systems and starting to share this. And we've been doing it, as you saw, with Atrium Health, with opioid, and we're starting to do it in other areas. So I wanted to give you an actual use case in the last 2-3 minutes here, in which we started to look at these GLP-1 and SGLT2 oral hypoglycemic drugs, very expensive, but very effective for lowering blood sugars in type 2 diabetics. This is something that I'll be humbled that I'm sure as an endocrinologist, Eric knows much more about than I do. It's probably a lot of you know about. But the other interesting thing in terms of evidence-based studies is that in individuals who not only have diabetes but have concurrent cardiovascular illness, it looks like they may be protective for future cardiovascular events and stroke. It also turns out in renal and nephrology, it looks like if you have concurrent renal failure and diabetes, they may be protective for those individuals. So getting the right drug to the right patient in the right way is important. But if you look at our prescribing data for the Brigham, General North Shore, and Newton Wellesley, and you look at all diabetic patients, and you look at diabetic patients with no cardiovascular events, and you look at diabetic patients with cardiovascular events, we basically prescribe the same of either a GPL1 or SGLT2 or their usual prescriptions, regardless of comorbidity. If you go to this Amplifier Platform, which is an online platform, relatively frictionless, and I'm giving you just one question, and it looks like a multiple choice question, but here we say Janet is a 53-year-old female. We sneak in that she had an MI 2 years ago. We basically say that her hemoglobin A1C looks pretty normal, and she's on a nice cheap generic of metformin 500 TID. And in talking with diabetologists or endocrinologists, like Enrico Caligiero, or looking at primary care physicians, and we basically said that this patient, because of their cardiovascular comorbidity, probably could be switched over to one of these agents, whereas 100% of the primary care physicians taking this online were confident and incorrect that no change was necessary for this patient. There are a lot of confounding variables. You have multiple clicks to either half fill or fully fill these circles. And so if you don't know and you click, it'll fill with one click and it'll be gray on your heat map. If you click twice, you'll be confident and it'll be green if you were correct, you mastered it. If you're confident and wrong, it will be red, meaning that you were confident and incorrect. And you could say, oh, I'll put half here and half here, and you'll be yellow because you're uncertain. And if you look at the heat map, and this is down the y-axis, de-identified learners, primary care physicians in our network looking at diabetes and opioid, and they were given a series of questions. I put a star next to the one that I showed you. Different individuals will be confident and incorrect, or they will be confident and correct. They might be unsure. Some of them just don't know. And you now have a strategic mapping of how you could generate in this program. It's an online program. Actually, this is about 5,000 nurses looking at infection rates. But you could basically see as you go further down, it's stratified by, you don't want this person, changing your central line, this nurse. You want this nurse changing your central line who's all confident and correct. But you also, because the algorithm in the online platform gives you the information based on your baseline knowledge. It'll peel away what you know and it will represent what you're unsure about or confident and incorrect about. And then it'll see how many times you need to see it before you master it. And it gives you at the right time for each individual, this is adaptive learning, it's a different time, a little bit of information weighted for cognitive load so you absorb it just at the right point at which your brain is appropriately activated. And some people need to see it many times. And then you can come up with basically a map for each individual of what they knew, what they didn't, and their route to mastery. And these reports are what are being used by the nurse educators to go out at the elbow. So you can stratify what it is that you're doing where you need a lot of overhead and people don't have to go and teach everything in person to everybody the same way. But you could stratify with your reports. This is what we want to show you and this is what you were having difficulty with. So keeping to the 40 minutes, I'm going to leave and then allow for some discussion if there is. I know it's a lot of information like drinking out of a fire hose, but Eric was asking me to kind of kick this off and set the stage and sort of throw it all out there and then kind of tee things up for future discussion and deliberation. You should feel free to call me or email me at any time. And then our administrative director, Mary Gilardi, is also available by phone or email if you want to come to us. Now, again, we're in discussions, and Eric and his crew in BEI and Jim at the MGH have also been a hub for this to kind of think about how, and again, this is not a one answer for all, but how this fits in with the general ecosystem we're building as a learning healthcare system, and that they are hubs at the two AMCs. And I know there may be other individuals who are participating or in the archived version may participate, but that's what we're thinking about, is how do you put this tapestry together? So I will stop and take a breath and then just see if there's any questions, and thank you again for your time.